Alrighty, welcome back everybody. Psychoactive drugs are those that alter perception and mood. And I would bet that most people who are watching this video have used psychoactive drugs because there are some really common ones that fall under this category. For example, caffeine, nicotine, alcohol. Millions of people use these drugs, but we're also talking about less common drugs, things like heroin, things like MDMA, which you may have used, but the majority of people have not. And so in this video and in this module, you're going to get more information about what psychoactive drugs are and how they change or alter our consciousness. So first and foremost, is drug use bad? Well, that's certainly a debatable question, but I think we should start with the basic answer that inherently no. Drugs are used for a variety of reasons, but I think stereotypically we think of drug use as bad in terms of leading to drug problems, things like addiction. So of course there's the potential for drug abuse, and that's something we'll discuss momentarily. So first and foremost, let's consider the notion that psychoactive drugs are categorized in terms of three major types. There are depressants, and depressants, they are going to reduce activity of the nervous system. So you know that sympathetic nervous system that we talked about in the last module, the fight or flight system that increases heartbeat, increases blood pressure. Depressants will bring that activity down. So think about alcohol, for example. Alcohol inhibits your behavior. It lowers anxiety, at least in lower levels. And by the way, all of that typically happens through the neurotransmitter GABA. GABA was discussed in an earlier module as well, and GABA has a depressing effect on the nervous system. So we're not necessarily talking about depressants as related to depression, feeling sad. We're talking about lowering activity of the nervous system. The opposite is true of stimulants. Stimulants, they increase our fight or flight response. They increase the activity of the nervous system. So increased heartbeat, increased blood pressure. And one of the most common stimulants used worldwide is coffee and caffeine. So what does caffeine do to you? It increases heartbeat. It makes you more alert. It maybe helps you study for your exams and things like that. So stimulants do the opposite of depressants. Finally, hallucinogens, they're in a category of themselves. So generally speaking, hallucinogens bring about sensory perception without sensory input. In other words, in extreme cases, you can see things that are not actually there, so on and so forth. Importantly, it's really difficult to categorize drugs in terms of just one of those three categories. And I love this figure 4.16 from the textbook. It really shows that a lot of common drugs, for example, LSD or MDMA, ecstasy, they do not fall neatly in any one of these categories. And so MDMA, for example, it has stimulant qualities, it has hallucinogenic qualities. Marijuana, same thing. It falls under, in some ways, stimulant, depressant, and hallucinogen. It's categorized as a mild hallucinogen. So it's difficult to categorize all of the psychoactive drugs in just these three categories. But from a basic discussion point, these three classes are great in terms of helping us understand what psychoactive drugs do to the body and to our consciousness. Research on psychoactive drugs is lacking, especially the illicit drugs. Things that are illegal, it's really difficult to get a study approved in terms of, maybe looking into the medical benefits of that drug. And take marijuana, for example. As certain states in the U.S. are legalizing marijuana for medical purposes and even recreational purposes, it's now more important than ever that we have a good hold on actual empirical evidence of the efficacy of these drugs. And so what we're starting to see is that more and more research is being conducted on marijuana, even MDMA for post-traumatic stress disorder. But there's still certainly a dearth of research on this topic, and that's a problem. One of the most important considerations when it comes to psychoactive drugs is abuse, misuse of drugs. And so down here we have three important terms: addiction, tolerance, and withdrawal. So what are these terms? These are probably things you're familiar with. They're broad terms. Addiction is, I think, the best definition of addiction is continued use of a drug or continued behavior in general despite unwanted consequences. And so when it comes to drug addiction, we're talking about repeated use. We're talking about compulsive use despite negative consequences. And so you can't help yourself, basically. And what's going on there? Is it physical? Is it psychological? It could be, and it could be both. So for example, alcohol, it has a really strong physical effect on the body. Alcoholics quite literally need alcohol to function, and therefore quitting drinking alcohol, to quit that is really, really difficult. It can put the body through a lot of stress to stop drinking because the body becomes so dependent on it. But on the other hand, there's a large psychological component to addiction as well. So what I haven't mentioned yet is that psychoactive drugs are not just biologically influencing our consciousness. There is certainly a psychological influence. For example, studies have shown that if you give people non-alcoholic beer, but tell them it's just regular beer, they're probably going to feel intoxicated. And that is because of the expectation, the psychological perception of what to expect when you consume something like alcohol. So there's a seriously strong psychological component to addiction as well. We get into habits. We tend to get into routines. The mind, as we'll learn through conditioning in a later chapter, we tend to do things and repeat things in patterns, whether that's physical or psychological. It's hard to separate sometimes, but it's probably both. And so the biopsychosocial model continues to be an important element of this chapter. Tolerance is the idea that with repeated use of a drug, we need to use more and more of that drug to achieve the desired result. And that is because of what biologists call neuroadaptation. So take cocaine, for example. Cocaine operates primarily through the body's dopamine regulation system. Somebody who uses cocaine is basically flooding the body with dopamine. But dopamine is a neurotransmitter that the body naturally produces. And again, what we've seen in the past is that our body is extremely efficient. It doesn't really like to waste any energy. So essentially, what is neuroadaptation? It's the idea that the body is saying, why would I waste my own energy synthesizing dopamine when I'm getting this for free? I'm getting artificial assistance with this drug, with cocaine. So the body stops producing its own level of dopamine because it's getting the extra from the cocaine. As a result, the individual needs more and more of that drug to get to that desired result. As a result, we end up with withdrawal symptoms when we stop using drugs. So if an individual is addicted to a drug, if they've been using a psychoactive drug for a long time, many of these drugs have withdrawal symptoms. And that would be defined as the uncomfortable and distressing feelings that one could experience following the discontinued use of a psychoactive drug. So again, it's basically the idea that the body has adapted to prolonged use of the drug. And then if somebody's life, if things go really bad and they have to stop using drugs, which obviously could happen, and they quit cold turkey, the body might be saying, well, hey, where did that balance go? Where's our homeostasis? And as a result, they might get horrible withdrawal symptoms. So psychoactive drugs put us through a complex biological, psychological, and even social dynamic that really affects the way we experience the world. It affects the way we are aware of ourselves and our environment. Why do people use drugs? Well, that's a very complex question. And I think maybe one of the ways we could conceptualize that question is by turning again to the 5 major perspectives in psychology. So first we have the psychodynamic perspective. Sigmund Freud, he might say that it's the id. The id is distracting our superego. The id is the part of us that just wants now, 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 pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. Forget tomorrow. So drugs feel good. I don't need to think about the long-term consequences of my actions. That's a very psychodynamic perspective. And he might also argue that people might be in denial of the problem. They're using those ego defense mechanisms. By denying that I have a drug problem, I don't have to feel anxiety about my behavior. From a behaviorism perspective, one of the reasons people use drugs is peer pressure. We know that having friends who use psychoactive drugs significantly increases the likelihood that one individual will also use psychoactive drugs. So the environment plays a strong role. All right. Social cognitive perspective. This might argue that some people develop addictive personalities, that the way they think about drugs in social situations makes them more likely to use these types of drugs. So of course, the social cognitive perspective, it's nature and it's nurture. It's the idea that we affect our environment affects us, reciprocal determinism. So we might have friends who use drugs, and therefore they change the way we think about drugs, thus making us more likely to seek out drugs again the next time we are in a similar environment. It goes back and forth, nature and nurture. 2 more, the humanistic perspective. That was about the pyramid, reaching self-actualization. One argument from a humanistic perspective of why people use drugs, you could argue that drugs bring about a state of euphoria, that it can bring about a transitive experience, that maybe people feel like they reach nirvana when they use drugs. They get to this place that allows them to really achieve something great in terms of self-actualization. Although maybe that's just the drugs talking. I don't know. Trait perspective. Last but not least, the trait perspective might argue that there are certain types of people who are more likely to use drugs. For example, you might argue that a neurotic individual is more likely to seek out depressants because depressants will lower a neurotic individual's anxiety. All right, so what I want to end on is simply the notion that psychoactive drugs, they alter our consciousness, and they can do so in quite profound ways. One study found that monkeys that learn to press a lever for a hit of cocaine, they will press that lever up to 10,000 times just for one hit of cocaine. They will stop eating. They will stop sleeping. They will stop having sex. They will stop doing anything that is important to them because of how powerfully rewarding that one hit of cocaine can be. So obviously that's a dangerous notion, and for that reason we have to consider again these topics of addiction, tolerance, and withdrawal. Inherently, drug use is not necessarily bad, but obviously it can lead to problems. And clearly it's a profound example of altering our state of consciousness.